Welcome back. Now, police have arrested more than 1,600 people in a week-long crackdown on so-called county lines gang.
Over 1,600 arrests, hundreds of knives taken off London streets, firearms recovered, millions of pounds in Class A drugs seized, cocaine, heroin, and synthetic opioids intercepted before they reached the streets. Cash recovered in bulk not counted, but weighed on police scales and loaded into vehicles like cargo. Vehicles, phones, and distribution assets removed in a single coordinated push. This was not disruption at the edges. It was a strike at the core of the supply system. But the real shock wasn't the drugs. It was who ended up in the handcuffs. Not distant cartel bosses, not faceless financiers, but teenagers, runners, and low-level enforcers. Young people pulled into a machine that doesn't look like crime until it has already moved into a family home. If you want to understand how London reached this point, stay with me, because the next part shows how the city became the distribution engine of a national problem. At 4:30 a.m., while London was still asleep, convoys were already in motion. Not one team, not one postcode, multiple coordinated entries in parallel. Council estates, tower blocks, short-term rentals, properties used as temporary bases, places where drugs are cut and stored, where phones are managed, where runners are dispatched. In the language of prosecutors, county lines networks commonly use violence and coercion, and they often take over a vulnerable person's home, so the office looks like an ordinary flat until it isn't. This wasn't framed as a random crackdown. It was resourced, scoped, and funded as an ongoing county lines response. Backed by up to £6.6 million, Operation Orochi was launched as London came under extreme pressure from county lines violence. That matters, because it tells you what the operation was built to do. Not chase headlines, but chase harm. Now zoom out. County lines is not one gang. By May 2025, concerns had emerged that the county lines model had expanded beyond the UK, drawing young Britons into overseas drug routes. The arrests of Bella May Cali and Charlotte May Lee raised questions about the existence of cross-border organized networks using similar methods and patterns. The National Crime Agency describes it as drugs being transported from one area to another, often across police boundaries, using dedicated phone lines and exploitation. It is designed to move product, move money, and move risk away from the people at the top and onto the people at the bottom. It is also repeatedly linked by government to violence and child criminal exploitation, meaning the labor force is often vulnerable, coerced, or too young to understand the consequences until it is too late. And that is where London's role becomes the center of gravity, because London is not just a market, it is a hub of redistribution, a place where bulk supply is broken down into smaller loads and pushed outward along rail routes, coach routes, major roads, and human networks that connect the capital to towns that cannot absorb the spillover. The effect is simple. When London's drug economy surges, the shock is not contained within London. It radiates. You see it in county force demand. You see it in missing children. You see it in violence that appears sudden in places that didn't have it before. The public often imagines drug supply as street dealers on corners. But county lines works more like a logistics business. A line manager, a phone, a rota, a stash location, a runner, a driver, a method of payment, a method of intimidation, and a method of disposability. Prosecutors describe how the operation can be overseen by a manager controlling a workforce, with runners, often children, reported missing. This is why London is described internally as a pressure point, not because the city causes national crime, but because the city's networks can scale supply, and scaling supply scales harm. Here is the part most people don't want to picture. A vulnerable resident's home gets taken over. The property becomes a cutting room, storage space, and dispatch point. The resident is trapped, coerced, threatened, or manipulated. In national enforcement reporting, police describe visiting hundreds of cuckooed addresses during county lines crackdowns, alongside safeguarding actions for vulnerable people. That tells you the shape of this crime. It is not only drug dealing, it is occupation. And when police go through those doors, they don't find a drug. They find weapons, knives, machetes, improvised blades, sometimes firearms. In a National County Lines Intensification Week reported in 2021, police said more than 1,100 arrests were made and 292 weapons were seized, including 33 firearms and 219 knives, alongside hundreds of address visits and more than 1,000 safeguarding engagements. That is not normal street crime. That is industrialized harm with weaponry built in. Now, to be absolutely clear, national results are not the same thing as one London operation, but they reveal what the model produces at scale: weapon recovery, safeguarding demand, exploitation indicators, and a footprint that crosses boundaries. That is the ecosystem Operation Orochi was aimed at in London. The violence that comes with supply lines, and the exploitation that comes with staffing those supply lines. This is why the real shock in the handcuffs matters. The shock isn't that police arrested criminals. The shock is the age profile, the disposability, and the constant recruitment. When supply chains are attacked at the street layer, the upper layers don't step forward, they step back. They replace, they rotate, they restructure. The workforce at the bottom is treated like a consumable part. But you cannot understand the force of this without the human cost, the part that never fits into a single raid video. England and Wales recorded 5,565 deaths related to drug poisoning in 2024, the highest number since records began in 1993. Of those, 2,621 deaths involved opiates and opioids. That is not a statistic. That is the size of a town wiped out over time. And the profile is shifting. Government health and law enforcement agencies have warned about potent synthetic opioids. Laboratory testing confirmed 179 deaths involving nitazenes in a 12-month period ending in May 2024. You don't need to say America to understand what that implies. When potency rises, the margin for error disappears. Cocaine harm has also surged. Deaths involving cocaine reached 1,279 in 2024, continuing a long upward trend. That matters because cocaine is not just party culture. It is often the fuel of violence, debt, exploitation, and the economics that keep lines running. Now connect the human cost to the recruitment machine. The Home Office has stated that county lines is strongly linked to violent offending and is a harmful form of child criminal exploitation. Estimates suggest around 15,500 children were identified as at risk or involved in exploitation in the year ending March 2025. And that figure is likely an underestimate. That is the labor pool the system feeds on. That is why handcuffs full of teenagers is not an incident. It is a symptom. So what does an operation like Orochi actually do in that landscape? It hits the visible nodes: line holders, runners, stash addresses, weapons, vehicles, and phones. It disrupts. It removes immediate threats. It prevents near-term violence. It creates breathing space for safeguarding and follow-up. And that breathing space matters, because enforcement without safeguarding simply reshuffles victims. But here comes the cold data moment. The measure of success cannot be arrests alone, because the model adapts. If the bottom layer is consumable, the system can refill it. That does not mean enforcement fails. It means enforcement has a ceiling unless something else changes. This is why two statements that sound opposed are both true. Hotspots can cool under focused policing, but the wider ecosystem can fragment, reroute, and surface elsewhere in less predictable ways. Local control improves while the system adapts. That is the trade-off when you treat crime as a network rather than a single location. And that is where strain begins to matter. Not pressure as a slogan, but strain as a measurable reality. Redeployments, overlapping warrants, safeguarding demand, and community trust. Because legitimacy is not a nice-to-have. It is oxygen. If communities believe enforcement is arbitrary, intelligence dries up. If communities believe enforcement protects them, information flows, vulnerable people are identified earlier, and networks lose cover. The UK context makes this sharper because the model crosses boundaries. London cannot solve it alone. County lines is defined as a national threat tied to violence. Any city-level operation is part of a larger chessboard. So here is the moral center of the story. Breaking supply lines reduces immediate harm. But the deeper war is about preventing exploitation and preventing death. We can count knives, we can count arrests, but we also have to count the human pipeline. The children recruited, the vulnerable adults whose homes are taken over, the families destroyed by poisonings, and the communities that normalize violence because it arrives in small increments until it feels permanent. Put the numbers together and this stops being just crime. It becomes a national harm engine. Operation Orochi sits inside that engine as a blunt but necessary tool. Remove immediate threats, disrupt lines, create space for safeguarding, push back against the most violent supply model. But here is the final question that decides whether the next decade looks different from the last. What happens after the doors come off the hinges at dawn? What happens after the knives are seized? What happens after the arrests? Because if the system keeps recruiting children, if vulnerable homes keep being occupied, and if record drug deaths keep climbing, then every operation becomes a holding action rather than a turning point. And that is why London's role matters, not as a slogan, but as a structural fact. When a city is the redistribution engine, its interventions ripple nationwide, and so do its failures. The country cannot treat this as London's problem. London is where the lines are assembled and where harm is routed outward. If you still believe this is just street crime, look at the death figures and the exploitation estimates and ask yourself how we accepted a system where a child can be a workforce unit in a supply chain that ends in a morgue. So the question is not whether enforcement should happen. It must. The question is whether enforcement will be matched with long-term action that ends recruitment, protects the vulnerable, and reduces demand. Because if it doesn't, the machine keeps running quietly, efficiently, and at record cost. If you think the badge should mean protection, type protect below. If you think Britain is sleepwalking into a permanent harm economy, share this because someone out there needs to wake up.